Today we're going to be looking at protists and fungi. This is chapter 10, part 2. We've been focusing on 6 kingdoms. Archaea, bacteria, they were in their separate domains, but were kingdoms in their own right. And now we have moved into domain Eukarya, which consists of the following kingdoms: Protista, fungi, Plantae, and Animalia. We looked mainly at protists last time in chapter 10, part A, so now we're going to focus on fungi. Just a quick reminder, protists are essentially the most diverse kingdom because Protista is pretty much a junk drawer when it comes to kingdoms. There are many different types of protists, animal-like, plant-like, and so there's tons of different variety. With eukaryotes, including Protista, we're seeing cells that have a true nucleus. Many are unicellular, but some are multicellular, like the colonial and multicellular protists we saw in the last part of chapter 10. Many of the protists live in aquatic environments, and we're going to see that if it's not completely aquatic, whether it's freshwater or marine, it's definitely a moist environment. Protists in general move by flagella, cilia, pseudopodia. It just depends on what type of protist we're looking at. Sometimes they're parasitic and they live within a host, such as malaria, or the one that causes the disease malaria. That's a protist that lives inside a mosquito. So the mosquito is essentially the host there for the malaria causing parasite. When we talked about protists, they were all animal like. They tended to be unicellular and they had motile movement that reminded us of animals. And they usually reproduce asexually, and that was via budding or binary fission. The plant-like protists could all carry out photosynthesis. They contained chlorophyll. Maybe not chloroplast, but they did all contain chlorophyll, the pigment that absorbs light and converts it to chemical energy. They're not plants, even though a lot of them look like algae or look like they have roots and stems and leaves. They do not have any of that. They have holdfasts and they have nodes and they have blades, but they do not have what we associate with plants. The fungus-like protists we looked at briefly: slime molds, mildews, some of which are parasitic, especially to plants. Other times, we looked at slimes that just happen to be decomposers and breaking down decaying matter. So while they can cause damage to crops, not all are going to be catastrophic. They are heterotrophic, and again, primarily that's because they're decomposers, not parasites. So that means we can finally, after that quick review, move on to fungi. And when you think fungus, you probably think mushroom, but the mushroom itself is really just a reproductive structure. Most of a fungus lives underground. So let's look at the fungi basics. They're eukaryotes. Most of them have many cells or are multicellular, but there's exceptions. There are some unicellular fungi, like yeast. They are heterotrophic. They are saprophytic, meaning not only do they eat other organisms, it's generally the remains of dead organisms. They're decomposers. There's only a few species that are parasitic. That's not the norm for fungi. They have extracellular digestion, meaning there's no ingestion. They do not take food in to break it down. Their reproduction involves spores, and their sexual reproduction is sometimes an option. So what are some of the fungi's structure and function? Well, what you're not the most familiar with is the mat of filaments, which are called hyphae, that form a mycelium. And that's actually the part of the fungus responsible for digestion, absorption, especially when we're looking at food and use of nutrients. Now, the hypha again is just the filament, and they weave together to form a mat of filaments called the mycelium. And this is really the body for a fungus. Now, most fungi do have cell walls around their cells. Many of them contain a chitin in their cell walls, and that's a chemical that provides both toughness and flexibility. What you're probably thinking of the most when you think of a fungus, again, is a fruiting body, the mushroom, the reproductive structure that produces spores. Here we can see a base mushroom with a cap, gills, where the spores would be, and a stalk. But it's all these filaments that form a mat called a mycelium that are the body and main structure for a fungus. So most of it's underground. Here's a really good look at the mycelium and then individual hyphae made up of multiple cells which are connected. So we have these cell-like components, and we don't necessarily see this segmentation in all different types of fungi. Some are more smooth, and we see that there's no cross walls, and there's many nuclei in one connected structure. So in kingdom fungi, we see some variation. Some cells are completely separate. Those are the septate hyphae with porous cell walls, but cell walls nonetheless separating cells. And the non-septate or conocytic hyphae that look like one big colonial cell and all the nuclei are spread throughout. When we're looking at reproduction, there is both asexual and sexual reproduction for fungi. There's therefore multiple means of reproduction. Now, if we're looking at sexual reproduction, we are going to see gametes produced. In those gametes, a sperm and egg must come together via the process called fertilization to form a zygote. And that's generally going to include the use of spores as the gametes that will eventually grow into the hyphae that become the mycelium. Fruiting bodies are going to be the structures that produce spores like a mushroom. But once the fruiting body is formed, it will rise out of the mycelium or mat of hyphae, and its spores mature before they're released. The cap and stalk that you recognize as the mushroom is the reproductive structure of the mycelium of many fungi. A lot of times the spores are going to be spread by the wind, but they can also be spread with water, or they could be spread by sticking to other substances or organisms. But spore dispersal is going to be primarily wind-based. So here you can see some spores moving. This is a puffball mushroom, and when squeezed, it would release spores. It does have contractile proteins in it that allow it to release these spores itself. It does not need to be squeezed, but when stepped on or squeezed, it will release them quicker. And kingdom fungi is also varied because it has over 100,000 species that are divided into groups, including common molds, sac fungi, club fungi, the chytrids, and imperfect fungi. So these organisms are placed in each class based on their sexual reproduction type. So that's what we'll talk about the most. So common molds or zygote fungi, they're going to have spores that are formed where their hyphae fuse with one another. And that will be for the purpose of reproduction. Now, the fusion of these hyphae with these reproductive spores creates a zygospore. And so that is the fertilization process that produces a zygote. But in this type of common mold, we're calling it a zygospore because it stays within conjoined hyphae. And those conjoined hyphae provide a hard protective covering. And so all of these organisms called common molds that we would see create a zygospore, they're going to be in phylum Zygomycota. So bread mold and cheese mold are good examples of this. 3 types of hyphae may be viewed: rhizoids, stolons, or sporangiophores. Now, rhizoids are just hyphae that penetrate the surface of a medium. They're anchoring. They can release digestive enzymes or even absorb some digested food. Stolons run along the surface of the medium, so they're not anchoring, they do not penetrate the surface. And sporangiophores are essentially hyphae that produce spores. So these are modifications we can see with the ones that we need for the zygospore. We're looking at the sporangiophores. Asexual reproduction can also occur, and that's just when spores drop on bread and they form new hyphae, creating a mycelium or mat, and they're going to be copies of other structures. Generally, these specialized hyphae do not become the sporangiophores because it's not sexual reproduction. Instead, these hyphae are just rhizoids, stolons, and they've been formed by mitosis. Sporangiophores may spring up from these, formed from mitosis, or copied from the original cells, but this would not be sexual reproduction. So hyphae from two different mating types growing together is required for the sexual reproduction of a common mold. If they're of the same type, that's actually just asexual reproduction. It would be a copying process. But true fertilization requires two different types of common mold having their hyphae grow together. So here is bread mold of a zygomycete fungi. So it's a common mold. You can see there's some that is fuzzy and that is on top, others that are penetrating. And so one of the most common bread molds is a great example of the use of sporangiophores and fused hyphae. So here you can see the mass of hyphae or mycelium underground. When reproduction needs to take place, we have the production of fruiting bodies, which at the end release spores. These spores can just deposit themselves in the medium, like bread, and then replicate themselves via mitosis. That would be an example of asexual reproduction. Or these spores can essentially be deposited in the ground and grow into new hyphae. And when two hyphae of differing types fuse together, that creates an early zygote that becomes another fungus. Also notice here the root-like hyphae. Root-like hyphae is another name or way to describe rhizoids. And they would meet underground, and this is how some of the mating pairs may form. Here is just a better view of those mating pairs. We do not call them male and female. They would be called positive and negative mating pair hyphae. When they fuse, they would create a early zygote. This is the zygospore that would undergo meiosis to produce gametes. And those would produce spores that could further asexual reproduction. So the resulting zygote is going to be protected by the nearby fused hyphae. So asexually, a stolon could also lengthen and form new filaments, or we could see spores just divide to create a new fungus. So both the mycelium and the fruiting body can function in asexual reproduction. The sporangia would be the structure that releases the spores. So again, both of those could be examples of asexual reproduction depending on the type of division that occurs. Now, if hyphae fuse and we see early zygospore development and then we get meiosis, that is sexual reproduction. Let's move on and look at the sac fungi or the ascospores, or sometimes called Ascidiomycota. That's because the phylum they are in is Ascomycota, and they're multicellular. There are some single-celled members in this phylum, but they're yeast. And sexual reproduction is a little bit more common in sac fungi other than the yeast, and it again is going to be caused by the fusion of hyphae of different mating types, and that union will produce a fruiting body in which asci form, or spores. An example of ascomycetes are truffles, which are round, warty fungi that are irregular in shape, and they vary from the size of a walnut to that of a man's fist. And Greeks and Romans, and even Europeans and ourselves, consider these delicacies, and they have been used in both aphrodisiacs and medicine. They're very expensive, and sometimes they're grated on top of food to add a certain type of flavor. Cup fungi are ascomycete fungi, and they are named cup fungi because of the structure of the bell or their cap. Morels are another example of ascomycete fungi. They tend to have these little spaces within parts of their cap. Claviceps purpurea is better known as ergot of rye, and that is a type of parasitic fungi that feeds on rye grain. And human consumption of this fungus could be deadly. It can cause headaches, vertigo, but also hallucinations and convulsions if consumed in high enough amounts. It's hypothesized that the Salem witch trials may have begun because victims ate this fungus and they started behaving strangely. So, ascomycetes fungi also include the unicellular yeast. So, yeast is used to make bread because it can undergo alcoholic fermentation and produce carbon dioxide, which produces the bubbles that we see in bread. It helps bread rise. yeast is going to break down or produce more organisms by budding. There is reproduction that is sexual. They can use spores, but yeast primarily is going to use budding, where a piece just buds off the parent, and that eventually will grow to be a fully formed yeast that is unicellular. Budding basically is a type of binary fission, and we've talked about binary fission in prokaryotes. Another pathogenic ascomycete is the one that causes Dutch elm disease that affects chestnut trees. Athlete's foot is another pathogenic type of fungus from ascomycetes, and both of them are more common than we would like. And actually, the Dutch elm disease and chestnut blight affect plants, whereas athlete's foot tends to affect animals, specifically humans. Club fungi are in Basidiomycota. They produce spores we call basidiospores, and the club-like, hyphae-like structures we call basidia. The basidiospores are the result of sexual reproduction. So that is the production of gametes that fuse, become a zygote. Many types of fungi are saprophytic, meaning they are going to break down decomposing substances, but there are some club fungi that end up being parasitic. So mushrooms are actually club-like fungi. Again, this is the fruiting body, this is the structure that would produce spores, and the actual mycelium of hyphae would be underground. The general life cycle of club fungi begins as the mycelium or mat of hyphae grows fruiting bodies that produce spores. And if these spores from differing mushrooms come together, fertilization can occur, and that can create a zygote. So we see the essentially intertwining of the hyphae for sexual reproduction. And a new mycelium can form once the hyphae exchange DNA after fusion. The new mycelium produced by sexual reproduction can quickly take over and crowd out the original parent mycelium, meaning that it can make it harder for the parent to exist in that same space. But the hyphae of the new daughter mycelium does form a complex web similar to that of the parent, and it is going to be the main body for the fungus. Sometimes we will see the web of hyphae enclose a membrane called a button, and that will be the beginning of producing a fruiting body. This button essentially becomes a mushroom, and it occurs when hyphae fill with water very quickly during this button formation stage, and eventually the stalk, or earlier it's called the stipe, and the cap of the mushroom can break through the membrane and then up above the soil. The cap again has the gills, and that's going to be lined with spores that can produce the basidiospores. So it's lined with basidia, which are structures that create these spores. All right, here we have a mature mushroom. We can see the stalk, an annulus, which is kind of like the sepals for flowers, gills, which produce spores, and the cap. We can see the mycelium, which is the net-like structure made up of hyphae. And hyphae can be continuous, or they can be septate, separated in the manner that the nuclei are not together. Here's just another picture of the club fungi. So you can see the cap, gills of the fruiting body, which is what we're calling the mushroom. Look at the underside of the gills. They tend to be very convoluted, so that increases the surface area for holding spores. There's also bracket fungi and puffballs and jelly fungi and even different types of mushrooms within the basidiomycete fungi. They all, however, produce basidiospores. There's also rust and smuts. So rust would grow in living plants, and that can hinder the plant's ability to grow. Wheat rust would be an example. It can be definitely bothersome and affect wheat leaves and decrease the plant growth for that particular type of wheat. Here's rust infecting a leaf. So we can see the splotches. That would be a type of basidiomycete. And then here is a Wheat rot smut with digesting old wood. So sometimes the infected organisms begin to be digested. We see this wheat rot smut is completely parasitic and it grows on wheat, barley, rye, and corn and breaks them down. All right, what about chytrids? Well, chytrids include spores that have flagella and can therefore move on their own. So we don't tend to see chytrids use spores that are carried by the wind. So chytrids are primarily going to be in muddy aquatic areas where their flagellated spores are going to have the best chance for mobility and moving about. A lot of them are going to be saprophytic. They're going to eat away at decomposing organisms, and some are parasitic. So an example of one chytrid that causes potato warts, like you see in the figure on the right, is Syncytrium indobaticum. So that is one example of a chytrid. There's also imperfect fungi, and these include fungi that have reproductive methods that are not completely categorized by the other groups. This does include fungi whose sexual reproduction phase is unknown, and that means we probably either think that they don't have a sexual reproduction phase, or we've only viewed their asexual reproduction phase. We put them in phylum Deuteromycota. The imperfect fungi are not necessarily closely related. Oftentimes we just don't know a lot about them. They do differ in their structure and appearance. They don't necessarily have a common ancestry. So like the entire kingdom Protista, the imperfect fungi or phylum Deuteromycota is a catch-all fungi category. Just like Protista was a catch-all category for those that are eukaryotic and unicellular and tend to be autotrophic or heterotrophic. So here are some examples of fungi imperfectae. A lot of them resemble different types of fungi we've already looked at, like Basidiomycota and Ascomycetes. Here is the penicillium fungi that actually can inhibit bacterial growth and was used in order to create the first antibiotic, penicillin. We can look at other types up close, and we can see their fruiting bodies here are very microscopic. And some of the imperfect fungi we're really familiar with, like blue cheese, or athlete's foot, or food mold, and baker's yeast. So anyone who studies fungi specifically is called a mycologist. We could look at how fungi impact life. Mainly, they're decomposers. They have symbiotic relationships with plants and algae, like lichens and mycorrhizae, which we've looked at before. And some are pathogens, so they can have a negative impact, such as that affects plants and animals, including the Dutch elm disease and athlete's foot. Now, with them being decomposers, that's probably one of the more positive impacts of life. They're very important recyclers of nutrients in all different types of biomes. Let's look more closely at lichens. So this is a mutualistic symbiotic relationship between a fungus and an algae. You have both foliate and kind of crustier forms of lichens. Some are jelly-like. So crustose tends to be smoother. Fruticose tends to have hyphae-like structures extended, and they tend to look tubular, whereas foliose tends to look kind of like fuzzy lettuce. Mycorrhizae is a fungus-root mutualistic relationship where fungi kind of use their hyphae and interweave them between plant roots, and that allows the plant to photosynthesize while the fungus more efficiently takes up nutrients and water from their rhizoids, which are essentially false roots. And so they work together to both get nutrients that they need to grow bigger and stronger. A lot of benefits to the plants include improved nutrient and water uptake, improved root growth, improved plant growth, yield, disease resistance, reduced transplant shock, and even reduced drought stress. So there's a lot of benefits for the plant, and there's some protection and nutrient transfer allowed to the fungus. And that is it for part 10b. So next we're going to be moving into chapter 11. So make sure to go back and look at Kingdom Protista and now at Kingdom Fungi. We have some base information about anatomy or their structure. We've talked about different types of reproduction, primarily asexual, including binary fission or budding. And a lot of fungi was multicellular. Make sure to go back and look at the exceptions, like yeast, which is helpful in making certain foods. Note the base categories, but primarily pay attention to the base anatomy, like that of the hyphae made mycelium and what is a fruiting body.